Hello everybody, my name is Zach with Overrated Gamers, and welcome to my deck tech of Scion of the Dragon. Before I get started, I do want to mention that I'm going to be doing a few changes for this deck tech. I'm not going to be going over most of the lands, most of the tutors, or the various utility cards. My reason for that is that it'll allow me to have more time to be going over what the deck wants to do, what it hopes to accomplish, and the core cards that help it accomplish that. It'll also allow me to shorten the overall length of the video. If you like this new format, let me know. I'll continue doing it. If you don't like this format, I will stop doing it and I'll go back to the previous format. If nobody mentions anything, I will assume that this format is okay and I will continue using this format. Anyway, let's get started on the deck tech. Scion of the Dragon is one of every color. He is a 4/4 with flying, with the ability pay 2, search your library for a dragon, put it into your graveyard. If you do, he becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn, and then you shuffle your library. So with this ability, you can respond to it, so you can pay 2 in response to it, do it again. You can do it as many times as you want, as you have mana to pay to do it. So you could do it 20 times if you wanted to, just to chuck a bunch of dragons in there. Then he'll cycle through each of those dragons one by one. In between him becoming each of those dragons, he does, you can respond by activating effects if those dragons have effects you can activate. Okay, so we have about 3 main combos that we can do with this deck to kill people. Our first one starts with Molten Steel being the first card. This is a 2-dragon combo. So first you pay 2, and then you pay 2 again. The first card you'll get is Molten Steel Dragon. He has an ability, and the ability is Phyrexian mana, meaning you can pay either, it's Phyrexian red, so you can pay either 2 life or 1 red mana to give him +1/+0 until end of turn. So you pay the 2 for Scion, you make, and then you pay it a second time. When he's Molten Steel, in response to him becoming the second card, which is Skithiryx, in response to him becoming Skithiryx, you activate Molten Steel by paying 12 life to give him +6/+0 until end of turn. Now, even though he now, after that resolves, becomes Skithiryx, the Blight Dragon, he still has the +6/+0, and Skithiryx has Infect, so he will swing, he'll deal 10 Infect to a player, and that player will lose the game for having 10 Infect. For those of you not familiar with Infect, creatures with Infect deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and to players in the form of deals damage to players as Infect counters. If a player has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. So that's the first combo. It's pretty straightforward. Something else, this is how Scion works. You will get questions about it. People will ask judges. I've been over it with multiple judges. Yes, you can respond to his ability. Yes, the Molten Steel combo does work this way. But at the same time, do be patient. Allow people to ask. Scion is a weird creature when it comes to rules. So if you build this deck, you will get a lot of judge questions. But it's fine. These combos do work. I have verified them with multiple people. Alright, our next combo actually involves just 1 dragon. It's just Dragon Tyrant. So he is a flying trample with double strike, and he is fire breathing. So, or what we like to refer to as fire breathing, which is pay red, give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So Scion will become a copy of Dragon Tyrant, and if you have 5 more mana after making him a copy, you give him +5, so he's an 11/6. He swings at a player, its double strike hits them for 22 commander damage, because even though Scion becomes a copy of another creature, it is still your commander. Our next combo involves Sword of Feast and Famine and Hellkite Charger. Sword of Feast and Famine is 3 mana for an equipment with an equip cost of 2. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has protection from black and from green. Whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card and you untap all lands you control. Hellkite Tyrant has flying and haste. When he attacks, you can pay 5 and 2 red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase there's an additional combat phase. So you equip the Sword of Feast and Famine. You make him a copy of Hellkite Charger. Now you do have to do this before he attacks because it triggers when Hellkite attacks. So you make him a copy before he attacks with the sword attached. If he connects with a player, you can then pay the 7 because your lands will have untapped. Take another combat and just keep taking infinite combats till you've killed all of your opponents off. Those are the 3 combos that our decks have, just to either one-shot players or to kill everybody in the case of the last combo. After that we have Atarka World Render. She's got Flying and Trample. Whenever a dragon you control attacks, it gains double strike until end of turn. So it's nice if you want to get a large swing in with your commander. Generally you could probably about 2 to 3 shot most people if you're just getting regular dragons out. And then she's also nice if you have other dragons on the field. She just allows you to hit your opponents really hard and do a lot of damage. Our next card is Utvara Hellkite. Whenever a dragon you control attacks, put a 6/6 red dragon creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Now this does trigger on attack, so to get it with the Scion you would have to do it before he attacks. Now the tokens also, if he is on the field, Utvara is on the field, the tokens will also just generate more tokens. He's a great value engine, gets you an army of dragons. And even just for the one-shot effect, you still get 1 dragon out. Tyrant's Familiar. This one is also triggered on attack. He works kind of interesting with Scion. He has Flying and Haste, and he has an ability called Lieutenant. As long as you control your Familiar, he gets +2/+2, and has whenever Tyrant's Familiar attacks, it deals 7 damage to target creature defending player controls. Now, Scion becomes a copy of Tyrant's Familiar, but he's also your commander, so he would get the Lieutenant ability from the Familiar. He's really useful for eliminating pesky blockers your opponents might have, or just creatures that you really want to kill, like Mikaeus, Triskelion, Avendra Zendikar, or even just if you want to knock out a Mana Dork or something, it just gives you nice value. Mana Charge Dragon. He has Flying and Trample and an ability called Join Forces. Whenever it attacks or blocks, each player starting with you can pay any amount of mana, and Mana Charge Dragon gets +X +0 until end of turn, where X is the total amount of mana paid this way. So Mana Charge Dragon can act as a political card. If there's one player who's doing really well and your opponents are scared of that player, you can ask them if they want to pay mana and help you kill that player off. It's pretty rare when players will agree to this, as oftentimes Scion is one of the scariest commanders on the board at the time. His ability to one-shot people will generally make them decide that they don't want to pay into it. We have Teneb the Harvester. So he has Flying. All the dragons have Flying in here. But whenever Teneb deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 2 and a black. If you do, put target creature from a graveyard under the battlefield under your control. Usually you hit your other dragons with it. This deck does have a Reanimator theme in it. And Teneb can get you some of your dragons back that you've put in the grave with your commander. So you get your early dragons in there for those early hits to kill people. They're in there later. You bring out him to make a copy of Teneb. And you hit them. You pay the 3. You can actually bring back Teneb with your commander doing this, because it hits the grave and he becomes a copy. The only problem with doing that is then they're both the same creature, so one of them would die. But if for whatever reason you felt like it, you can. Bladewing the Risen. Usually you're not going to make your commander a copy of him, but when Bladewing enters the battlefield, you may return a dragon from your graveyard to play. So you can play Bladewing, once again getting back other dragons that you've put in there earlier in the game. You can also pay a black and a red to give all dragons +1/+1 until end of turn. So there are a decent amount of dragons in here that will support your other dragons. It is worth noting, Bladewing does buff your opponent's dragons as well if you use that last ability. So if they have dragons out, they will also get bigger when you use it. We have Hellkite Tyrant. Flying Trample. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. He also has a second ability, but it's a little less relevant. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. Now that ability sounds really fantastic and spectacular, but I have never, in the 2 or 3 years I've played with this card among my decks, have I ever seen it win with that second ability. I'm sure it does happen. Usually he just steals some of your opponent's cards, either you steal rocks and get a bit ahead, or you just deny them some of their resources, you steal some of their powerful artifact creatures, you steal things like their Strionic Resonator so it interrupts their tempo. So, yeah, it does all that nice stuff. Good card advantage. We have Steel Hellkite. Flying. Pay 2 to give him +1/+0 until end of turn. X. Destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. You can only activate this ability once per turn. So you can hit your opponent with your commander, make it a copy of the Steel Hellkite, and then, well, you have to do you make a copy of the Steel Hellkite, and then you can destroy all their 1-drops, or all of their 2-drops, or all of their 3-drops. It's more useful if they're a tribal deck, because generally tribal decks will have a lot of 1s, or they'll have a lot of 2s. Sometimes they'll have a decent amount of 3s. Against other players, it'll hit maybe 1 or 2 problem cards, but it can still eliminate threats to your board state, or can just knock them down a turn or 2. Dromar the Banisher. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 2 and a blue. If you do, choose a color. Return all creatures of that color to their owner's hands. It's also worth noting that because he becomes a copy of Dromar, he's not green or red at the time. So if you choose green or red, your commander will still stay on the board, because this hits everyone's creatures. You can also use this to attack player A if you want to bounce player B or player B's permanents off the field. Knock out a lot of their threats. Say they're a mono green deck, they've dropped an Avenger, you think they might try to hoof next turn, they definitely don't have mana to do both. Well, you can bounce all those to their hand, those tokens are gone, the Avenger's back in the hand. Stuff like that. Kaiga the Tidestar. Flying, and when he dies, gain control of target creature. It's a useful effect if someone board wipes to turn your commander into this. If they're just board wiping you, with something like, say, Toxic Deluge, and it's just going -4, -5. He can also, you bring him back later. He's a decent body. People don't want to kill it. You can also, get a guaranteed swing on someone with this. He is actually one of the weaker dragons in the deck. If I do see a better dragon come out at some point, I'll replace it. I've made this deck going through what I feel personally are the best dragons currently in Magic. If new and better dragons are released eventually down the road, maybe I'll update the list a little bit and post a very short video on that. Balefire Dragon. Flying, of course. Whenever it deals damage to a player, deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. So you hit a player, you kill all their little dudes, you kill their mana dorks. You can also force a block with this card if they have one flyer and you just really don't like that flyer and you want to trade with it. Well, you can force the block, and then they block, their creature's dead, you're killing your commander, but I mean, if they have to do it to keep their other creatures out, it can be worth it sometimes. We have Karthus, Tyrant of Jund. Usually you also don't make your commander into Karthus. It's one of the few dragons that we don't have in here to make Scion a copy of. But he has Flying and Haste, and when he comes into play you gain control of all dragons, then untap all dragons. Other dragons you control have Haste. So this card works really well with Living Death, which I run in here. It resurrects all your dead creatures and kills all the living creatures. I'll go more into Living Death in a few minutes. But he also, if you drop him just normally, then you can drop a few other dragons. Those will have haste. As I've said, this game can play into the late game. So if that's happening, you have a lot of mana, you can drop him, drop another dragon, swing with those, swing with your commander. You just have a lot of big, hasty, scary dragons out. And a lot of decks will run 1 or 2 dragons if they're playing red, especially red-green decks, so you get a little bit of advantage out of that. Nicol Bolas. This is one of the dragons this dragon you never actually want to cast, because at the beginning of your upkeep you have to pay blue, black, and red, or sacrifice him. Whenever he deals combat damage to an opponent, that player discards their hand. So this basically knocks the player out if you hit them early on. They have nothing they can do. They have to start slowly building up with just 1 card per turn. So if there's someone that you think is going to go ridiculously fast, if they're a goblin like a Krenko deck, or if you know they're a combo deck, you can just hit them with it, knock them out for a few turns so you don't have to worry, and then continue with your original plan of knocking out some of the other players with one-hit combos or one-shots. Scourgicare Ridges. He's a living board wipe, basically. You can pay 1 in a red, and he'll deal 2 damage to each creature without flying. You can pay 5 in a red, and he'll deal 6 damage to each other creature with flying. So you can kill all your opponent's flyers off, you can kill all their ground creatures off. Usually if you've brought him out, you have the mana to do these abilities. I mean, you only need 8 mana to make him a copy, and then pay the 6, and most flyers are not bigger than 6/6 usually, so it's almost guaranteed to wipe your opponent's flyers out. And doing 2 to ground creatures, I mean, you can pay 6 and you've done 6 to all the ground creatures. So either way, you pay 6 to deal 6 to everything that either has flying or does not have flying. Those are the dragons. We have Volrath's Stronghold. It makes colorless mana. It's a legendary land. You pay 1 in a black to put a creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. So this card can either be used to reload cards into your deck, so you can use them again with Scion, or you can use it to avoid an opponent's Bojuka Bog or other form of grave removal. We have Scroll Rack. It's a 2 mana artifact. Pay 1 and tap it. Choose any number of cards in your hand and set those cards aside. Put an equal number of cards from the top of your library into your hand, then put the cards set aside this way on the top of your library in any order. You use this card if you've accidentally drawn a dragon that you want to make Scion a copy of. So you just tap it, you set aside your hand, or any number of cards from your hand, get that many cards from the top of your deck, then put the cards you set on top of your deck in any order. You can also use it if for whatever reason you had to sorcery speed a Vampiric Tutor, and then if you need to get that card right away. It can also just help you dig if you need to find an answer. And Living Death. It's 3 and 2 black sorcery. Each player exiles all creature cards from his or her graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures he or she controls, then puts all creatures he or she exiled this way onto the battlefield. So you use this to finish your opponents off. You bring all your dragons out, hopefully with Karthus in the grave. And if he's in the grave, they'd all have haste, and you just get one massive blowout on your opponents. You can also put dragons into your graveyard a turn or 2 before you know you're going to do this. Just activate his ability a bunch of times, play the Living Death, you got an army of dragons, everyone dies in one fell swoop. We have Phyrexian Reclamation. It's 1 black enchantment, 1 in a black, pay 2 life. Return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. So this is more for in a bit of the later game. You can start returning dragons to your hand and just start manually casting them later in the game, especially if they're cards like Bladewing. Your commander can basically tutor things into the grave, and this can put them into your hand. So essentially you're paying 4 mana and 2 life to tutor creatures to your hand. It's not terrible. Kind of a fun interaction. It's also just decent if, even if they've killed your commander, you can return him to your hand so he doesn't start costing a lot. We have Necromancy. We run 4 reanimation spells in here. Specifically, these guys, I'm not counting the dragons when I say reanimation spells. But Necromancy is 2 and a black enchantment. If you want to, you can play it at instant speed, but then you sacrifice it at the end of the turn. So when you play Necromancy, you basically bring a creature back from the grave, attach Necromancy to it. If Necromancy leaves the field, the creature dies. Use this to get your own dragons, of course, but you can put your dragons in there early on. Use this to get them back out after your Scion has become a copy of them. Even just getting Molten Steel out is pretty decent, even if you're not paying the life into it. Just paying mana to swing with that and having your commander out. It's not terrible. Well, as you get further and further in the game, this card starts getting a lot better because you have things like Utvara Hellkite in there. And then when your commander's swinging, and then the Utvara is swinging, you start getting tokens, and you just start amassing an army on the board. Animate Dead. So it's 1 and a black. Brings a creature back from the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets -1/-0. Of course, this Necromancy, my reanimate spells, these 4 can target any creature, but you usually enchant your own with them. But yeah, this one just gives it -1/-0, but it's 1 and a black. If this enchantment dies, the creature dies. Dance of the Dead is arguably the worst, but it's still only 1 and a black to play. So it reanimates a creature from the graveyard, so it brings a creature back into play. It comes in tapped though, and it gets +1/+1. It does not normally untap unless you pay 1 and a black. So you do have to pay 2 mana to untap it every turn. So it's a bit of a downside, but it's still good enough to run in here in my opinion. You can also just target things like Karthus with it just if you want to give your dragons haste, and even if you don't want to attack with the Karthus. And finally, Reanimate. It's only 1 black, and it's a sorcery, and it reanimates a creature. You lose life equal to that creature's casting cost. So my commander is 5 mana, so I would lose 5 life if I reanimated him. And finally we have Entomb. This is in here mostly for those other reanimate spells. You can reanimate on turn 1 or 2 and have something like a 6/6 or a 7/7 out. It's 1 black instant. Search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard. So you can either do this in response to something like Living Death. You can do this in response to if you play one of your dragons that reanimates dragons. You attack with Teneb, you can cast Entomb, and then Teneb has a really nice card to target. You can use this on turn 1 and then turn 2 reanimate, or if you crack your Lotus spell on turn 1, you can turn 1 Entomb and reanimate. Just get out a turn 1 Utvara Hellkite, start making 6/6s really early, and that card will just snowball out of control on its own if no one deals with it. And that's Scion of the Ur Dragon. It's a great commander if you love going all in, if you love dragons, or if you love reanimating. As I've mentioned before, I really like decks that go all in. I love Molten Steel Dragon. That is one of my favorite cards in the game. But his strengths, of course, lie in his ability to very quickly knock out at least one player. And if no one's dealt with him after that, you can straight up knock out a second after that. As early as turn 4, you can pretty easily knock out one player from the game pretty quickly. It does become a bit of a struggle after that, because players have seen what you can do at that point, or after people have just seen what your deck can do once before, they will try to kill the commander. But that's when the plan B of reanimating everything comes in. In a sense, you could say your commander's kind of a red herring, because you bring him out, people kill him, and then you just start bringing out the other dragons anyway through reanimation, through things like Entomb. If you want, you can put Buried Alive in the deck and just chuck 3 in there early on. Things like that. There's a lot of room for change in the deck. If you want, you can run other dragons. These are just personally the dragons I find to have the most utility and the best value in the deck. But yeah, so he is a bit weak to removal early in the game. The deck's weak to grave hate like Bojuka Bog. I have a couple cards in there that I have in there to try to protect against it, but I mean, it can happen. That's always the risk you run with a reanimation deck, is that someone will Bojuka Bog you. But I mean, what's Magic without a bit of balance, you know? Everything can get hit and everything can be dealt with. That's what makes it fun. But anyway, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.